Picture this for a second. You are standing at the absolute peak of a freezing, windswept mountain.
Okay, setting a scene, I like it.
Yeah, just imagine it. The air is incredibly thin, the environment is harsh, it's unforgiving, and it's completely silent. There are no crowds up here at all, there's absolutely no noise, and the only moving thing you can see is a single eagle.
Just one.
Right, just one. It's flying completely solo, riding the thermal currents with its wings spread wide, and it is completely owning this vast emptiness of the sky.
That's a powerful image.
It is. Now hold on to that image because I want you to contrast it with another one.
Uh-oh, where are we going with this?
Imagine a massive, just deafening, artificially lit warehouse. The smell of ammonia is overpowering. Inside, thousands upon thousands of industrial chickens are packed together, just shoulder to shoulder.
Wow, okay, total opposite end of the spectrum.
Completely. They're squawking continuously, stepping over one another, fighting for tiny scraps of feed, and blindly waiting in the warmth of this massive crowd to, well, eventually be led to the slaughterhouse.
It is a stark, honestly almost jarring visual contrast to open with. We are looking at a deeply provocative, highly uncompromising video essay and a stack of related notes today. It is a piece of content that takes the typical soft-spoken advice you usually hear about self-development and completely incinerates it.
It really does. I mean, instead of talking about finding your bliss or, building a supportive community, this material merges personal growth with hardcore clinical, economic, and financial terminology.
It's intense.
Very. It challenges everything society has conditioned you to believe about the value of networking, the stigma of being alone, and the actual mechanics of building personal value.
Which brings us directly to the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to meticulously deconstruct a concept the source refers to as the societal trap of connection intoxication.
Connection intoxication.
Yeah.
That phrase alone is so loaded.
Right. We will pull apart the framework's distinction between the toxic liability of loneliness and the high-yield asset of true solitude. And finally, we are going to walk you through a highly systematic, painful, but supposedly rewarding process of personal research and development that this material calls monk mode.
Before we really get into the mechanics of this, we do need to explicitly set the parameters for you, the listener.
Yes, very important caveat here.
The text we are analyzing uses aggressive, highly capitalist, and I'd say borderline Darwinian analogies. As you heard with the opening imagery, you're going to hear recurring references to wolves, sharks, sheep, commodities, and, well, slaughterhouses.
Our objective here is not to endorse this framework as the definitive blueprint for human existence.
Right, we're not telling you this is the only way to live.
Exactly. Nor are we taking a stance on its intensely competitive worldview. Rather, we are here to neutrally unpack a very specific, highly structured mental model. We want to explore how applying strict financial and economic principles to your personal energy and time might offer a radically different lens for viewing your daily habits.
So let's look at the starting point of this framework. The source begins by diagnosing what it considers to be a widespread modern disease, which is that connection intoxication we mentioned.
The argument is that from the moment you are old enough to understand language, society programs you with a default behavioral code.
And this code dictates that you must be highly social. You must cultivate a massive network. You need to attend the gatherings, be seen at the right places, and maintain a constantly buzzing phone if you want to be considered successful or even just well-adjusted.
The implication being that if you find yourself frequently alone, you are fundamentally failing at the social game.
The material frames this conditioning not merely as an accidental cultural norm, but as a highly effective, almost invisible psychological trap.
And to understand why it works so well, we actually have to look at the evolutionary psychology that the text builds its entire premise upon.
Right, going back to our caveman days.
Precisely. Human beings possess a deeply ingrained instinctual terror of abandonment. If we go back tens of thousands of years to the ancestral environment, being isolated from the tribe meant certain death.
You couldn't hunt alone, you couldn't defend yourself alone against predators, and you definitely couldn't survive the winter alone.
So to be a marginalized weirdo standing on the edges of the group was essentially a death sentence. Your brain wired itself to panic if you weren't accepted by the crowd.
That makes total sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah.
Our brains are hardwired to associate the crowd with safety, even today.
Exactly. The framework argues that this ancient fear is still operating in our modern brains, and it is so overpowering that it drives people to act in ways that run completely counter to their own long-term interests.
Because we are terrified of that primal isolation.
Yes. We act like moths flying blindly into a flame. People will throw themselves into meaningless late-night parties, engage in hours of superficial gossip, and just exhaust themselves fulfilling trivial social
They
obligations,
do this because the warmth of the crowd tricks their nervous system into feeling safe.
even if the crowd is actively holding them back.
Now, the evolutionary angle provides great context, but where this material takes a really sharp turn is when it abandons psychology and starts using corporate finance to describe these social behaviors.
This is my favorite part of the text.
It's so unique. The text introduces an analogy where your personal time is framed as the ultimate non-renewable capital. Furthermore, your daily energy is the literal fuel required to run the money-making machine that is your life.
This is where the framework becomes incredibly analytical. It asks you to view your social calendar not as a diary, but as a financial balance sheet.
A balance sheet for your life.
Exactly. If your time and energy are your only truly finite capital, then how are you investing them? When you trade 3 hours of your evening to sit at a bar and complain about coworkers with acquaintances you barely even respect, the text categorizes this as a catastrophic investment.
You're taking your most precious, limited capital and burning it.
And in exchange, you receive what the author terms emotional cheap change.
Emotional cheap change. That is a brutal phrase.
It refers to a fleeting, low-value feeling of temporary inclusion.
But wait, emotional cheap change is a very clinical way to describe human interaction. I mean, is the argument here that all casual socializing is inherently worthless? How does the author justify such a transactional view of human behavior?
The justification lies in the concept of return on investment. The text isn't necessarily arguing that human connection is worthless. Rather, it argues that superficial connection, driven by the fear of being alone, yields a terrible return.
Okay, that distinction matters.
It does. It forces you to audit your life like a ruthless portfolio manager. If an investor continually dumped millions of dollars into a failing company just to avoid the discomfort of admitting they made a bad choice, they would be fired.
No way.
The material argues that anyone who bleeds their own time and energy just to avoid the temporary discomfort of their own company is essentially bankrupting their own potential. They are willfully entering into deeply unprofitable transactions.
Let's ground this for the listener because the source poses a direct, almost uncomfortable challenge here.
It asks you to pull out your smartphone right now.
Yeah, literally right now.
Yeah.
Scroll through your contacts, look at the dozens, maybe hundreds of casual acquaintances, old coworkers, and people you grab drinks with. Then it introduces the financial concept of liquidity.
Now, before we apply that to the phone contacts, I should briefly define liquidity in a strict financial sense.
Please do.
In finance, liquidity refers to how quickly and efficiently an asset can be converted into ready cash without affecting its market price. Cash is the most liquid asset.
You can spend it instantly.
Exactly. Real estate, on the other hand, is highly illiquid because it takes months to sell a house and access the money. If you have a crisis and need capital immediately, an illiquid asset is of no use to you in that exact moment.
Okay, so bringing that back to the framework, the text asks, if a massive life crisis hit you today,
Say you lost your job or faced a severe medical emergency.
or your reputation was suddenly ruined, how much liquidity do those relationships in your phone actually have? How quickly could those casual text threads be converted into tangible, reliable support?
The stark conclusion drawn by the source is that the vast majority of those connections have absolutely zero liquidity.
Zero.
They are highly illiquid assets disguised as wealth. The text argues that all those superficial handshakes and party connections would evaporate the moment they are tested.
It points out a brutal mathematical reality. The sheer volume of friends in your contact list does not correlate to the stability of your life.
When the storms of life actually hit, the casual crowd scatters.
That is a harsh assessment of the typical social circle. But it smoothly transitions into the next major pillar of the material, which scales this up from personal relationships to macroeconomics.
The source claims that the crowd itself is inherently poor, both financially and spiritually.
And to prove this, it applies the most fundamental rule of economics directly to human value, the law of supply and demand.
This is a cornerstone of the entire argument. Let's break down the law of supply and demand briefly. In any market, if the supply of a particular good is incredibly high and the demand is relatively normal, the price of that good drops significantly.
Right. If there are 1 million identical apples for sale in a town that only needs 1,000, apples become virtually worthless.
Conversely, if there is only one rare diamond and many people want it, its price skyrockets due to scarcity.
So how does the material apply this to the concept of the crowd?
It posits that the crowd represents a massive, overwhelming oversupply. Think about what the average crowd consists of. It is an oversupply of a generic, easily replaceable labor.
It is an oversupply of cliché, unoriginal thinking, and predictable, herd-driven emotions.
Because the crowd behaves uniformly, watching the same shows, complaining about the same problems, chasing the same superficial trends, it acts as a giant pool of identical commodities.
Which means the economic reality for anyone in that crowd is that their value drops to the absolute price floor. The text is issuing a severe warning here.
A very severe warning.
It dictates that if you choose to stand in the crowd, if your habits, thoughts, and outputs are indistinguishable from the average person, you are actively pricing yourself at the cheapest possible market rate.
Precisely. You render yourself a perfectly replaceable commodity. The uncompromising view of the text is that if a generic member of the crowd disappears, the societal and economic machine doesn't skip a beat.
It simply reaches into the massive pool of oversupply, grabs another identical unit, and plugs them into the empty slot.
To command premium compensation from the world, whether that is in the form of financial wealth, deep respect, or high-level autonomy, you have to step away from the oversupply.
You must deliberately manufacture scarcity around yourself. In the terminology of the text, you must become a limited edition.
A limited edition, I love that phrasing.
I want to look at how this economic framing recontextualizes a very common psychological phenomena, FOMO, or the fear of missing out.
Well, this is a great pivot in the text.
Usually we treat FOMO as a mild annoyance. It is that little pang of anxiety you feel when you are sitting on your couch on a Friday night and you start obsessively checking your friends' social media to see what party they're at.
But this text doesn't treat it as a quirky side effect of having a smartphone. It diagnoses FOMO as a state of profound emotional poverty.
Yes, the source uses a very specific economic metaphor here. It describes FOMO as a trade deficit of the soul.
Let's define a trade deficit in national economics. It occurs when a country imports significantly more goods, capital, and services than it exports.
It means the country is not self-sufficient.
Right. It is highly dependent on external sources to sustain its standard of living.
Applying that to an individual sitting at home scrolling through social media, the imagery used in the material is quite stark. It visualizes this person not as a victim of algorithms, but as an emotional beggar.
The text describes them as holding a chipped bowl, desperately knocking on the doors of the internet, begging for scraps of attention, validation, and entertainment from the outside world.
Because of that trade deficit of the soul, this individual cannot domestically produce their own happiness, meaning, or sense of worth.
They have to import every single drop of it from the external crowd. The framework suggests that a truly autonomous individual, someone who has built their own internal empire, views their absence from the crowd not as missing out, but as a strategic retention of their valuable presence.
They consider their time to be of such high value that withholding it is the default position.
When you are paralyzed by the fear of being left out, you are essentially handing the remote control of your emotional state over to a marketplace of people who do not actually have a vested interest in your long-term success.
Which brings us to a mathematical concept. The material leverages heavily. The rule of averages.
We are all familiar with the old self-help adage that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
But this source takes that soft advice and applies it with what it calls brutal mathematical certainty.
The logic here is straightforward but unforgiving. If you allocate the majority of your finite time to interacting with 5 individuals who lack ambition, who constantly complain, and who view themselves as victims of circumstance,
the mathematics of human behavioral syncing guarantee that you will become the 6th victim.
it's almost described like physics. The text claims the crowd possesses a terrifying gravitational pull.
It argues that the collective average actively resists excellence because excellence highlights their own mediocrity.
Therefore, the crowd is constantly subtly trying to drag anyone who attempts to rise back down to its comfortable, low-effort baseline.
That gravitational pull is the exact reason the framework insists on a physical and emotional break from the herd. But to execute that break successfully, the material pivots to what is arguably the most critical distinction in this entire analysis.
It is the hinge upon which this whole philosophy swings.
The source asserts that the vast majority of people make a fatal foundational error in their vocabulary. They mistakenly equate loneliness with solitude.
Right. In everyday conversation, people use those words completely interchangeably. If you are by yourself, you are lonely, or you are in solitude. It means the same thing to most people.
But the text treats this conflation as a massive error. It argues that not only are they different, they are exact opposites on the balance sheet of human experience. They are mortal enemies. Let's break down this distinction thoroughly, starting with loneliness.
To continue the financial through line, the text categorizes loneliness as a massive liability. In accounting terms, it is bad debt.
When you are lonely, you are operating in a state of deep, agonizing emotional deficit.
You may be physically situated in a room by yourself, but your mental state is chaotic and externally focused. Your mind is out wandering the streets, hanging out at cafes, desperately staring at your phone screen, waiting for a ping or a notification to deliver a microdose of dopamine.
You are bankrupt on the inside, so you go out into the marketplace of life looking to take out what the text calls a high-interest emotional loan.
But wait, what does taking out a high-interest emotional loan actually look like in practice?
In practice, it looks like posting something highly curated on social media and checking the engagement metrics every 5 seconds. It looks like agreeing to go to an event you hate just so you aren't sitting at home.
The high interest you are paying on that loan is your anxiety, your loss of self-respect, and your exhaustion, and the marketplace is incredibly efficient at detecting this.
Just as institutional investors can smell the desperation of a failing company and will instinctively pull their capital out, the human social market instinctively recoils from someone who is radiating the needy, grasping energy of loneliness.
So, the cruel irony here is that the more intensely you crave the crowd out of a sense of loneliness, the more the crowd is repulsed by your energetic deficit.
This creates a downward spiral where the lonely person is forced to take on even worse terms for their loans, like settling for objectively toxic friends or abusive romantic relationships just to fill the physical void.
The text describes this as drinking poison simply because you are dying of thirst.
Contrast that entire mechanism with the framework's definition of solitude. If loneliness is bad debt, solitude is classified as the ultimate asset. It is pure equity.
The material defines active solitude as a state of massive surplus capital. When you are in a state of solitude, you are not isolated because the world rejected you. You have intentionally, strategically withdrawn yourself from the noisy, chaotic marketplace.
You step back to restructure the enterprise of your existence. You are no longer borrowing validation from external sources. The source uses the phrase, "You become your own central bank."
You are minting your own joy, forging your own meaning, and printing your own emotional currency.
To make this abstract concept highly concrete, the text provides an illustrative contrast. I want you to visualize this scenario clearly. Imagine two different individuals sitting in the exact same coffee shop.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The first individual is sitting alone at a corner table. However, he is visibly anxious. He is rapidly scrolling through his phone, constantly refreshing feeds. His eyes are darting around the room, subtly checking to see if anyone is looking at him or judging him for being by himself.
He is physically occupying a single chair, but he's completely enslaved by the invisible crowd in his head. The text asserts that this person radiates the unmistakable scent of emotional bankruptcy.
Now, look at the second individual at a different table. He's also entirely alone. But his demeanor is the exact opposite. He is unhurried. He is calmly reading a dense book, occasionally taking notes. His eyes are focused. His posture is grounded and composed.
He is utterly indifferent to whether anyone in the cafe is observing him because his internal ecosystem is entirely self-sufficient. The text argues that this individual radiates quiet power and the steady hum of a rising autonomous empire.
The fascinating part of this illustration is the crowd's reaction. The framework argues that while the crowd may not be highly intellectual, its primal instincts are razor sharp.
The collective will subconsciously look down upon and avoid the lonely, anxious individual, but it will inherently respect and even slightly fear the solitary, composed individual.
The physical circumstance is identical. They are both alone, but the underlying position is entirely different. Are you the helpless victim of isolation, or are you the deliberate master of your solitude?
That raises the most practical question of this entire deep dive. If we accept the premise that active solitude is this incredibly powerful asset, this state of supreme equity, how does an individual actually achieve it?
How do you transition from being a reactive pawn pushed around by the fear of missing out to becoming the sovereign ruler of your own attention?
According to the source material, the mechanism for executing this transformation is a highly regimented phase called monk mode.
Now, monk mode is a term that gets thrown around a lot on the internet, often associated with asceticism or dropping out of society. The text is very quick to clarify its specific definition. It does not mean shaving your head, donning a robe, and moving to a physical cave in the Himalayas.
No caves required. In the context of this framework, monk mode is defined as an extreme, highly calculated phase of total focus and isolation. It is an intense period of what the material calls R&D for the soul.
And to explain this, the text relies on another detailed corporate analogy. Let's look at the mechanics of corporate research and development.
Imagine a massive, once successful global corporation. Currently, its sales are tanking, its core products are horribly outdated, and it is bleeding market share to competitors. What is the standard operating procedure for a competent CEO in this crisis?
The CEO does not throw a lavish corporate retreat to pretend morale is high. They do not pour millions of dollars into flashy billboard campaigns to market a broken product.
Instead, they do the exact opposite. They immediately shut down all outward-facing public relations. They ruthlessly audit the company and cut all superficial, bloated costs.
And they funnel every single available dollar, alongside their top engineering talent, into a secret, locked-down research and development lab. They accept a temporary period of absolute silence and zero public glory in order to build something undeniably superior.
The core message of the text is uncompromising. You are that failing corporation.
If you are dissatisfied with your current value in the marketplace of life, whether that is your financial status, your physical health, or your intellectual output, you must shut down the public relations department of your life. You have to willingly enter the R&D lab.
The first operational rule of entering this monk mode phase is declaring what the author terms martial law on your attention. Let's explore that.
We live in an attention economy. The tech companies, the advertisers, the social platforms, they all view your focus as a highly lucrative, highly exploitable resource.
The text argues that every time your phone pings with a notification, every time an app demands you look at a red dot, it is attempting an unauthorized capital withdrawal from your finite energy reserves.
That phrase, unauthorized capital withdrawal, perfectly encapsulates the financial lens of this framework. To stop the bleeding of your capital, the material states you must become ruthless.
You must permanently delete the junk apps designed to harvest your attention. You have to exit the noisy, low-value group chats. You must systematically decline the casual invitations to grab meaningless drinks.
You are tasked with turning your immediate physical and digital environment into a strict no-fly zone for cheap, uninvited noise.
But practically speaking, executing that level of withdrawal is going to trigger a reaction from your social circle. People might call you arrogant. They might say you are acting weird or that you think you are too good for them now. How does the framework reconcile that social friction?
It frames that friction not as a problem, but as a necessary stop-loss mechanism. Let's define a stop-loss order in stock trading.
It is an automatic trigger set by an investor. If a stock's price drops below a certain threshold, the system automatically sells the asset to prevent the investor from losing their entire portfolio in a crash.
So by shutting out the noise and ignoring the complaints of acquaintances, you are triggering a stop loss on your own opportunity cost. You are protecting your core capital from being dragged down by a crashing social dynamic.
Correct. So once you have secured the perimeter of your attention and entered this dark, boring isolation, what are you actually doing? The text makes it clear that monk mode is not a vacation.
You are in the lab to build the asset. You are engaging in heavy, highly unglamorous lifting.
The text gives specific examples of this R&D. You read dense, challenging books not for fleeting entertainment, but to literally load data and new operational frameworks into your mental operating system.
You commit to rigorous physical training, not to look good for a beach photo on social media, but to forge what the text calls a biological tank, a physical vessel that possesses the stamina and chemical baseline required to house an iron will.
You study aggressively to acquire high-income skills so that you have tangible, undeniable leverage when you eventually return to the marketplace.
The author describes this silent, unseen accumulation of value as a totally legal form of insider trading.
Insider trading on your own future. Let's unpack that, because it's a fascinating concept. In finance, insider trading is illegal because you have non-public knowledge about a company's upcoming success, allowing you to buy shares cheaply before the market finds out and the price skyrockets.
Exactly. But applied to personal development, it is the ultimate strategy. You're the only person who possesses the non-public knowledge of the immense work going on inside your R&D lab.
You are steadily buying up shares of your own stock through discipline, skill acquisition, and health, while the rest of the market still prices you based on your old mediocre self.
With absolute certainty that your inherent value is going to skyrocket when you finally reveal the results, but you are accumulating the equity at the ground floor price.
That sounds incredibly empowering on paper, but the text is also very stark about the psychological reality of this phase. It warns the listener that monk mode is not just about grinding out work while listening to motivational music.
It involves a deeply painful, solitary psychological surgery that the material refers to as the internal audit.
We need to explain what a corporate audit entails to understand why this is so difficult. A financial audit involves bringing in an objective third party to meticulously examine every single book, ledger, and transaction of a company to find discrepancies, hidden debts, and inefficiencies.
It is invasive, stressful, and exposes all the lies a company might be telling itself about its health.
So when you apply this internally during monk mode, it requires confronting the discrepancy between who you claim to be and who your habits prove you actually are.
The text points out a profound psychological mechanism here. When you cut out all the external noise, when the loud music stops, when the superficial laughter fades away and your phone goes completely dark, that is when your internal demons finally have the silence required to speak to you.
All of the psychological baggage you have been avoiding rushes to the surface. Your deepest, unexamined fears of failure, your unresolved past traumas, your lingering inferiority complexes, and your secret anxieties about never amounting to anything, they all launch a synchronized attack.
And this framework argues that this exact moment of attack is why the crowd runs away from solitude. The average person is absolutely terrified of that silence because the silence forces them to listen to the audit of their own flaws.
It is too painful. So the moment the anxiety hits, they run back to the club, they turn on the television, or they jump into the group chat to drown out the internal noise with external static.
But the mandate of monk mode is that the solitary person does the exact opposite. You do not run. You sit completely still in the dark and you stare those internal demons down.
Yeah.
You endure the discomfort of the audit.
This leads the text to force a complete redefinition of the modern concept of healing.
I found this section particularly uncompromising. If you look at mainstream culture today, society heavily markets the idea that healing is a soft, passive process. Healing means going to a luxury spa, taking a mental health day to binge watch a show, or engaging in gentle self-care routines.
The author of this framework rejects that paradigm entirely.
In this model, true healing is described as a brutal, active intervention. Healing means picking up a surgical scalpel yourself and painfully cutting out your own toxic mental tumors.
It means conducting the internal audit and asking yourself highly uncomfortable questions without letting yourself off the hook. Why am I consistently lazy? Why am I paralyzed by the fear of other people's opinions? Why do I feel the need to lie to seem more impressive?
You cannot hire someone else to drain the infection. You have to do the surgical work yourself in the silence.
It is an intense, grueling process, but the text promises a massive payoff. It calls the result of surviving this audit spiritual financial freedom.
Let's define what that means. It describes a state where your core identity is so solid and your internal foundation is driven so deep into bedrock that absolutely no external market fluctuation can shake you.
If you lose your job, you don't panic because you possess the high income skills and the psychological resilience to pivot immediately.
If a relationship ends or someone abandons you, you process the grief, but your foundational self-worth is entirely unaffected because it was never tied to their presence in the first place. You have transformed from a fragile structure dependent on the weather into an impenetrable fortress.
To ground this in reality, the source points out historical examples, specifically looking at the genesis of massive tech empires like Apple and Amazon. These companies did not start in gleaming, glass-walled skyscrapers with millions of adoring fans cheering them on.
They started in the exact conditions of monk mode.
Look at the actual history. You have individuals like Steve Wozniak or Jeff Bezos operating in cold, cramped, completely isolated garages. There was no immediate feedback loop of praise. There was no social validation.
They had to endure the extreme sensory deprivation and social isolation of that environment to focus entirely on building a superior core product. They were conducting the ultimate R&D.
And the framework brings that history right to the listener's doorstep. Right now, in your own personal garage, in your own R&D lab, your core product is you. You are the technology being developed.
However, the text issues a major warning at this stage. As you sit in the lab, as you begin to improve this core product, elevate your discipline, and inevitably start rising above the average baseline of your old life, you are going to encounter a severe external problem.
You will face massive, sometimes vicious resistance, resentment, and even outright hatred from your former peers.
To navigate this, the framework dictates that you must execute a ruthless maneuver it calls the Great Purge, or a massive stop-loss operation on your social portfolio.
To explain why this resistance happens, the source leans on a well-known sociological concept, the crab bucket effect.
The crab bucket effect is a powerful metaphor for human group dynamics. If you go crab fishing and put a single crab in a bucket, it will easily climb out and escape. But if you put a dozen crabs in that same bucket, you don't even need to put a lid on it.
Why? Because the moment one crab starts climbing up the side, demonstrating the ability to escape to a higher reality, the other crabs will physically reach up, grab it, and pull it violently back down into the mass at the bottom.
They ensure that they all die in the bucket together rather than let one succeed.
The text argues without hesitation that the human crowd operates using the exact same mechanics. When you start trying to escape the mediocrity of the bucket by losing weight, starting a business, or quitting a toxic habit, the crowd will not celebrate you.
Your success forces them to confront the audit they are avoiding, so they will try to pull you back. They will label you arrogant. They will call you a traitor to your roots. They will say you've changed, as if evolving is a crime.
To survive this phase without being dragged back down, the author insists you must rigorously apply the 80-20 rule, also known as the Pareto principle, to your relationships. In economics, the Pareto principle states that 80% of consequences come from 20% of causes.
In business, 80% of profits often come from 20% of clients.
The framework applies this directly to your phone contacts. It argues that if you conduct an honest audit, 80% of the people you interact with are likely bad debts and energy vampires.
Let's clarify what that means. These are individuals who only reach out to you when they need to vent and complain, when they want to gossip about someone else's failure, or when they need a companion to join them in a toxic habit like binge drinking or procrastinating.
The source is remarkably unforgiving on this point. It states that permanently deleting these energy vampires from your life is not an act of cruelty toward them. In fact, continuing to keep them around and allowing them to siphon your time is an act of profound cruelty toward your own future potential.
You have a fiduciary duty to your future self to cut the bad debt.
But dealing with the anger and jealousy of those you leave behind is emotionally taxing. How does the listener reframe that guilt? The text offers a fascinating perspective shift. It asks you to view the hatred, the gossip, and the jealousy of these people not as a tragedy, but as a tax.
A tax on success. It is the cost of doing business at a higher level. The source actually posits that the resentment of those who refuse to grow is the most prestigious certificate you can ever receive.
It is empirical, market-driven proof that you are finally heading in the right direction. If the crabs aren't trying to pull you down, you aren't climbing high enough.
It poses a deeply polarizing question to the listener. Are you willing to pay the cost of temporary isolation to build a skyscraper with a foundation of steel while everyone else around you is happily, loudly building straw huts on shifting sand?
Which logically brings us to the culmination of this entire demanding process. We have covered the isolation, the painful internal audit, the skill acquisition, and the brutal social purge. But what is the ultimate ROI? What is the return on investment for enduring monk mode?
Eventually, the R&D phase has to end. You don't stay in the garage forever. The door's open. When you finally re-enter the marketplace of the world, the source uses a perfect corporate finance analogy. It describes this re-entry as the initial public offering, or the IPO, of your new self.
Let's explain an IPO. When a private company has grown quietly and built massive value, it eventually decides to go public and sell shares on the stock market.
The day of the IPO is when the broader market finally gets to look at the books, see the R&D, and assign a massive monetary valuation to the company.
According to this framework, when you unveil this upgraded, highly skilled, emotionally unbreakable, limited edition version of yourself, the market has no choice. It is completely forced by the laws of supply and demand to reprice you at a premium.
And this repricing fundamentally alters how you navigate the world. The material uses a marketing analogy here to track the shift. It describes a transition from outbound marketing to inbound marketing of the self.
I want to dig into that. Before monk mode, when an individual is lonely and desperate, they are engaging in outbound marketing. Think of cold calling or a guy standing on a busy street corner desperately trying to hand out cheap, poorly printed flyers to anyone who walks by.
Most people ignore him, swat the flyer away, or throw it in the trash. That is what it looks like when you beg for attention and validation.
But after completing the R&D of monk mode, you have fundamentally transformed your offering. You are no longer a cheap flyer. You have become a luxury, highly scarce good.
Luxury brands like Rolex or Ferrari do not stand on street corners handing out flyers. They rely on inbound marketing. Their inherent quality, their scarcity, and the gravity of their brand are so powerful that the market comes to them.
You don't need to hand out flyers of your time anymore. Because of the extreme scarcity you have manufactured, the entire dynamic of your life flips. You no longer have to exhaust yourself chasing money. Your newly acquired high-income skills ensure that capital naturally flows towards your competence.
You no longer have to demean yourself chasing down high-status networks. Your undeniable value dictates that you are the high-quality network that others are now desperate to access.
By mastering the mechanics of solitude, you transition from being an outcast begging for inclusion to becoming a gravitational center. You become a magnet.
But let's address the endpoint of this philosophy. Because the goal, as stated even by the text, is not to remain a hermit living in a cave until you die. We are a social species. So what happens to your social life after the Great Purge and the IPO?
The text explains this beautifully, or rather, starkly, with the concept of clouds meeting at their own level.
The framework clarifies that you isolate yourself during monk mode, not to reject the concept of human connection forever, but to fundamentally upgrade your operational altitude.
It brings us full circle to the opening imagery of the deep dive. Once you put in the grueling, unglamorous work to transform yourself from one of those cramped industrial chickens into a sovereign, highly capable eagle, the laws of nature dictate that you will naturally begin to fly alongside other eagles.
The relationships you form at this newly achieved altitude are entirely structurally different from the ones you purged from the bucket. They are no longer based on shared misery, the mutual trauma of being victims, the desperate need to kill time, or the exchange of emotional cheap change.
Exactly. They become strategic alliances. These new connections are built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared ambition, and the exchange of actual tangible value.
You willingly sacrificed the meaningless, noisy, high-liability nights out in the short term in order to earn the capacity for million-dollar handshakes, profound intellectual partnerships, and high-equity relationships in the long term.
So we have covered an immense amount of ground, merging deep evolutionary psychology with clinical market mechanics. Let's distill the core thesis of this uncompromising deep dive.
The argument presented by the source material is this. The warm, fuzzy feeling of the generic crowd is a dangerous evolutionary illusion designed to drain your most precious capital, your finite time, and your vital energy.
By willingly stepping out of the herd, and by embracing the harsh, cold, but highly truthful reality of strategic solitude, you reclaim ownership of your life's enterprise.
By executing a stop-loss on your junk portfolio of toxic relationships, and by possessing the sheer courage to pick up the scalpel and audit your own psychological flaws in the total silence of monk mode, you enact the ultimate transformation.
You evolve from a desperate, emotional beggar knocking on doors for scraps of attention into an undeniable, highly valued sovereign power. It is a ruthless framework, but the logic it presents regarding the allocation of human energy is incredibly difficult to completely refute.
Which is why we want to leave you with a concrete challenge based on these mechanics. Tonight, I want you to open your calendar. Look at your text message history. Audit your daily habits with the same brutal third-party objectivity of a corporate accountant.
Ask yourself, are you currently utilizing your finite capital to build an undeniable empire in the dark? Or are you just another face in the crowded warehouse, huddling together with the rest of the flock, bleeding your energy just trying to stay warm?
It is a heavy, almost intimidating question to sit with. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to explore on your own. It builds directly upon the source's financial analogy of utilizing absolute isolation for personal R&D.
It's an important question to ask right now.
It really is. If we accept the premise that monumental value is only forged in absolute, undistracted isolation, the kind of pure silent monk mode the source describes, we have to look at the trajectory of modern technology.
Because the world is getting louder.
Much louder. How does the current reality of omnipresent artificial intelligence, wearable biometric tech, algorithmic tracking, and constant digital surveillance fundamentally alter our ability to ever truly go off-grid?
If the digital market is always watching, always tracking your location, and always quantifying your habits, will true, dark, untrackable solitude soon become an extinct asset?
Will the ability to enter a true monk mode soon become a luxury available only to the ultra-wealthy? who can actually afford the immense cost of completely disconnecting from the grid. Something to think about as you audit your own attention. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.